Hello, this is Dr. Tim Harrison. I'm coming to you from the Institute of Advanced Philosophical and Religious Studies in Bristol, Virginia, aka my crib. I'm joined here by my graduate assistant, Blair the Airedale, right there. Say hello, Blair. And we're here to talk about the forming of the New Testament. Now, the New Testament is made up of many books. They were written over what is actually a very short period of time, depending if you're a traditional scholar. Remember, we made the distinction between traditional and modern scholars. Traditional scholars would say it began somewhere around 50 CE, or going to about 90 CE. The modern scholars would say around 50 CE to 140 CE. We'll see the distinctions as we go along. And this is called the process of canonizing. A canon is the process by which different writings are put together. Okay, and it is used as a means of evaluating and looking at how the New Testament is put together. Now, as we mentioned, the New Testament was originally Koine Greek, which is common Greek, the Greek language of common people. And the writings were put together very early on. The early church fathers, the followers of Paul and John and Peter, began making distinctions between what was written by their teachers and what was not. Now, there was a huge amount of things that were written. And as I mentioned before, you will see people who talk about the lost Gospels or the lost books of the Bible. They weren't lost. They were simply not included in the New Testament because they were not written by apostles or first-hand accounts from apostles. And there was a process of putting these together. They were finally canonized, or all put into one book, a codex, around the 300 CE time during the Council of Nicaea and during the reign of Constantine. Now, it's important that you realize the books were understood. It was sort of known and already sort of solidified in the first century church which books were authentic and which were not, but they were not canonized until 300 years later, because that's sort of a misquote quite often by those who attack the authenticity of the New Testament. One of the reasons they felt that they had to do this, there were heresies, teachings that were arising that were starting to make their way into churches, and they wanted to make sure that only the authentic books of apostles were included. They were only considered the ones who had the divine right or the divine inspiration to write such writings. Okay, the two heresies that come about is Marcionism and Gnosticism. And then finally we see that it is all put into the common language of the day. Greek was a common language, but as Rome grew, Latin becomes the dominant language, and then the Bible is put into what is called the Latin Vulgate. Again, the Latin Vulgate is written in common language for everyday people. We see that there are fragments. We don't have the one book, but we have many fragments of the writings going all the way back. Some believe that there are actual writings that may have been first century, second century fragments of the book of John and some other writings during this time. So now the earliest copies that we have aren't quite that old, at least in extent. We have fragments of books, but not any book in full extent. Okay. Now also, although the books are translated, they are translated strictly. So there aren't different translations. For instance, the King James Version, which is the most common type of translation, is, according to most scholars, around 97 to 98% accurate to the actual first writings that we know of in the transcript. So when someone says that the Bible has been changed because it's been translated, they don't understand what they're saying because it's not true. It is words may change, the meaning of words change, and so those words may change, but the idea, the translation of the text itself, the idea of the text hasn't changed, and most translations try to be very true to the Hebrew text or the Greek text in which it is written. Okay, so those are some of the problems. Now there are some transcript issues. There are words that are used in place of other words that might give different meanings. There's the difficulty of transmissions from a culture to another culture and how that's done. But none of the translations that come later are different from what we think we had in the first century when Paul and Peter and Luke and the others were writing these books of the New Testament. Now, one of the important people who helped to establish a common Greek text came much later. He was a humanist teacher by the name of Erasmus, and he developed a Greek New Testament edition. And in that is sort of where we learn Koine Greek and go back in time and able to translate. It had sort of been lost in the time up into the Enlightenment period. When I learned Greek in both college and seminary, I used some of the texts and some of the work of Erasmus to help me understand the Greek context, the Greek words, tenses, and things of this sort that he developed. Now, it has always been controversial to translate the Bible. In fact, early on, the church did not want, after the Vulgate was written, it was written so that everyone could read the Bible, but pretty soon what took place was the priests and the power brokers of the church realized that if they were the only ones who could read Latin and translate the Bible, particularly in Europe where Christianity spread into places where Latin was not known except by the most intelligent or the most learned, common people did not know Latin, that they had great power because they told people what God said. And there's a great deal of power in that. So there was a great resistance when people were trying to translate the text into common languages such as English. Many of the early English writers of the Bible, like Wycliffe and Tyndale and others, are put to death for translating the Bible. We find that odd today, but that's why the King James Version was so extraordinary when it came about, because it was allowed to be given to anyone. Anyone could have a Bible at that point. So it becomes very important. Martin Luther, of course, translates the Bible for the German people. So that is also important as well. There were a couple of important Bible translations, just a few of them again, is Tyndale, the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible, and then finally it culminates in the King James Version, which is, again, still the most popular version of the New Testament and Old Testament, and still today holds a special place in people's heart when they go to read the Old and New Testament. It was commissioned by James I of England. He brought together the best scholars in the world of that day to translate the Scripture. Scholars looking back at their work found it absolutely extraordinary what they were able to do. Again, the accuracy in the King James Version in translating the text from ancient Greek and Hebrew was nothing short of extraordinary. Now there are some shortcomings to the King James Version, certainly. Some of the words and phrases that are used. Also, they use euphemisms. Euphemism is when you use a phrase or a word in place of an actual word. For instance, we talk about going to the bathroom. Well, when we go to the bathroom, we don't go to take a bath, so it's a euphemism. So there are several euphemisms that are used because it's written in the King's English. And they did not want to include things that might be seen as beneath the mores and the morals of that time. Okay, so in summary, we see that canonization took about 3 centuries in length, a process, but remember, very early on, from the very beginning, after Paul and Peter's death, the followers of the disciples, of the apostles, already had a very clear idea of what was authentic and what was not. There are some difficulties in compiling accurate texts for the New Testament, but there are some very good ones out there, and we believe that we have a very clear and a very accurate text as we have it today. And we see this culminating in the Latin Vulgate, again translated for the common people. Later it is taken by the church as only being able to be translated by clergymen. And then later we see again the Old and New Testament are returned to common people using, interestingly enough, not common language, but the King's English in the King James Version. Okay, that's our lecture for this week. Hope you have a good week, and I will see you next week.